would be visible for everyone. Oh, clearly. I haven't read in quite a while, so I'll volunteer to start us. And Abigail, if thou live to be a woman of perfect years, keep thyself unspotted, and let not thy mind out after sports and pastimes. The end of all these is sorrow, neither of young men. If thou have a desire to marry, do not thou seek a husband, but let a husband seek thee. And if thou live in God's fear and an honest life and virtuous, they that fear God will seek unto thee. Let not thy affections out unto every one that proffers love, but be considerate, and above all things choose one, if thou dost marry, that loves and fears the Lord, whose conversation thou knowest, and manner of course of life well before thou givest consent. One more sentence. Be discreet and wise, hide nothing from thy mother, and she will advise thee, no doubt, for thy good. And if she be living, marry not without her consent.
I'd like to halt there before we go on and say that her father has given her a difficult assignment, because if she's young and normal, no matter what the culture, if she takes a fancy to Charlie or Sam, it's going to preoccupy her. And if Charlie or Sam expresses a desire to marry her, and she has not yet asked her mother's consent, nor considered what his character and conversation are, she's still going to be very, very preoccupied. Like, what would it be like to be in his arms and say, "My darling, I love thee"? Or hear him say that to her. That's a part of the heart that just can't be stopped. And I remember that from my teens, my 20s, my 30s, and now I'm in my 80s. And I know I'm still susceptible to that sort of thing. And the only thing that can sober me up is, how would it be to be with this person for the long haul, when I am trying to be mindful of the presence of God within me and all around me at every moment of my time. And I want him never to ridicule me or make light of my desire to live that double life of praying without ceasing and also trying to be a loving and faithful partner. That's hard. I'm and I'm sure that Francis Howgill knows that, and that his wife, her mother, knows that. But it's a very, it can be a very hard yoke to carry unless Abigail asks the Lord's help and says, Lord, I can't carry this unless you enable me.
There's something about culture and time. I was part of a culture where for for a time from my 20s where someone seeking to marry a woman would ask the parents as a safeguard in a sense of knowing the Lord had gates keeping protection. So many marriages fail these days, and we're comparing this culture to that. And my husband asked my parents, and if it were just my mother, probably would have done that as well. And I didn't mind waiting for that. And my guess is the culture that Abigail grew up in, with the focus on the leading of Christ, might have her heart settled to be okay with that. Or maybe even to welcome the way opening through Christ rather than the doors being closed, which could be a warning.
I was struck by how many times he uses or he refers to living in God's fear. He does that 3 times in the sentences that were read. He says, if thou live in God's fear and an honest life and virtuous, they that fear God will seek unto thee. And then later he says, if thou dost marry, or a little bit earlier, above all things, choose one, if thou dost marry, that loves and fears the Lord. So it seems that that is a qualification that he is guiding her to look for and to be aware of in those whom she would consider marrying. And it's a good advice, because those that fear God will be mindful of not behaving in a way that would endanger their relationship with God. They would fear that endangering that most crucial relationship. And if they are in that state of fearing God, they will be monitoring themselves to see that they don't act unjustly or dishonestly or loosely. And if a person or if spouses each are mindful of not acting dishonestly or loosely, the marriage is far more likely to thrive. So I can see why he would choose that qualification and advise Abigail to look for it in the prospective marriage partner.
Did you have more, Pat?
I'm sorry?
Do you have more?
No, I'm finished. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just found it interesting, and I think he's right, but I'd never really thought about it before, to my disgrace, that if she's living an honest life and virtuous, those are the people who are going to be attracted to her. He's confident in that. I think it's true.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not as sure as
No, I think sometimes people try to gain something that they lack by acquiring it through a partner. I think there's a sort of a cultural version of that called the attraction of opposites. So it's not always the case. I think that she's just going to draw the virtuous and the God-fearing ones to her.
I'm really appreciating how important it would be for her to have wise counsel from her mother or another elder, because this young woman is probably going to lead a quite a sheltered existence and not be exposed to a lot of dangers. The radar may not be very strong on her own, but somebody who's lived longer and seen more needs to be by her side.
When you love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, there's very little that's more attractive than a man who has that kind of love for the Lord. It was number 2 on my list, was to have a husband who loved the Lord with all his heart, soul, strength, mind, and strength, and I would be second on his list. And we had a blessed and happy marriage for 23 years. And I believe that wasn't something before I started really focusing on God that I would have looked for in someone. And I don't think I'm anywhere near perfect, or was. But I guess we can't look outside ourselves, and when we speak of love, think that everybody else in the world doesn't understand that kind of love for God. Maybe it's rare, but I think she's someone who would have been nurtured and enriched in the spirit, and that the longing of her heart would to be having a marriage with someone who was equally drawn to the Lord and focused on the Lord.
I think so too, in spite of my first speech that spoke of um, the absolute ferocity of the heart in love. But after I had spent 30 years in a relationship with a very angry, chronically angry woman who despised Christianity, which I was becoming more and more committed to with every year of our marriage, especially when parenthood came. It was hellish. But I clung to it for the children's sake and because I had made a promise in the presence of God to be her partner till death do us part. Nonetheless, she kicked me out. And I thought, well, I'm no good at marriages. But 6 months later, I fell in love with Elizabeth, with whom I had a very happy marriage. But the first thing I told her was, I've fallen in love with thee. And now I have to pray about what to do about it. And that was the key that unlocked everything else. I never imagined saying such a thing, and I think she had never imagined hearing it. But that established our relationship as one that was to be lived in the presence of a God who loved each of us and loved our being in an honest and good and mutually encouraging relationship, which we were able to have by his grace. So I have, having tried marriage both ways, I'm quite in agreement with Francis Howgill's advice to Abigail. And I sense the kind of mindset that I would want Abigail to have too. And forgive me, this is making me break out in tears, but I'm very grateful that the Lord showed me what a good Christian marriage can be.
As a gospel minister, I often see things in reality that speak to me as a visual or some kind of symbol of things spiritual. And one example is occurring to me, so I might as well say it. About 20 or 25 years ago, I guess, my family was visiting our relatives in St. Paul, Minnesota, my husband's relatives. And we were at my sister-in-law's house, and she had just her husband was a builder, and he had just built on a wing in their home and had created a bedroom, a master bedroom, and a bathroom that she was showing us. And so we were looking at this, and I saw on the bed, well, it was a stripe of navy blue and white stripe bed cover. And at the top near the pillows were three throw pillows. On the two on the outside edges were navy blue, and the one in the center was white. And I looked at that, and it just spoke to me about the necessity in a marriage for two people to have Christ centered in that marriage. And that was those pillows symbolized that to me. They were Presbyterians, so they did not believe that sin could be overcome in this lifetime. And I wondered whether she was aware that those dark navy blue pillows on the outside of that arrangement could symbolize the two partners in the marriage. And yet in between the two was a white pillow, which to me symbolized Christ. In that white usually symbolizes purity and the divine. So that little arrangement there on the master bed, in the master bedroom, adequately or appropriately spoke to me of the right relationship in a marriage, that Christ needed to be in the center of two imperfect people. So I never asked her about it. And I've always wondered whether she did that intentionally or whether it was just fortuitous that happened.
I am having some difficulty with my screen share, so I'm going to stop it for just a moment and then restart it. Would anyone like to continue the reading?
I can read. I'm just going to use a little larger text on my screen here. And if thou join to a husband, be sure thou love him in thy heart, and be obedient unto him, and honor him among all. So will his heart be more to thee, and his love increase. Grieve him not, but be gentle, and easily to be entreated, and mind thine own business. And if the Lord give thee children, bring them up in God's fear and in good exercise, and keep them in subjection unto thee, and be an example of virtue and holiness unto them, that the Lord's blessing thou may and in age and all thy life long.
That first sentence is a bit of a stumbling block for me, but I'm going to read obedient as respectful. Was the baggage that carries in our age is pretty heavy. I wonder what others think.
I suppose that injunction arose from that it was better to have peace in the home than to have conflict or striving between wills. I think that with our modern loss of faith and even the semblance of faith, that there is, the field is wide open for there to be conflict between people who naturally strive to have their wills prevail. I think, Paul often says things like that too. And he's also cautioning against not being subject to the authorities, the political authorities, the magistrates. And I think for the same reason, it's that the energy and the focus of a life can be diverted and lost if the life is consumed with this need to prevail. And I think that Paul was assessing the situation and saying, if this movement is going to move forward with as much power as it needs to have, we can't be siphoning off our strength in run-ins with the authorities and in the same, along the same lines within a home. If there's going to be peace that is needed for the family to thrive, then there has to be sort of a settled understanding of where authority lies. I'm not saying this is always good in every situation, or even that it's good in any situation. But I think it makes an allowance for the human tendency that is so strong in people to control and to prevail in social situations.
I agree with Pat, and I also want to stress that Paul was always making clear that he was Christ's slave and sought nothing more for himself than perfect obedience to Christ. And he told the Corinthians, at least, be ye imitators of me. And the Philippians, what you have seen in me, do. How important that is. If the leader of a movement is fully subjected in obedience to Christ, why would anyone want to follow him if that means following and imitating someone whose will is given up to serve the will of Christ? And secondly, anyone who follows Paul in that is bound for a shipwreck of faith if he can't make himself as small and obedient as Paul made himself. And I can't forget that Paul in Latin means small one. And I think Christ gave him that name because that was the thing he needed Paul to be most of all, is to make him this lion of a man, to make himself as small as he could so that Christ could rule in him. That being so, who could detect rebellious male egos misbehaving quicker than Paul could see them, and entreat his followers not to be so arrogant and self-willed. And of course, this would be a great mercy to their wives and children too.
That's a tremendous Christian paradox, is that in valuing the truth, we cannot help but see ourselves as we are. And that reduces us mightily. which is the necessary thing. That dying to the self is the doorway into being raised into that new powerful life in Christ. So you have in Paul this kind of what is his statement? This paradox in made perfect in weakness. That's the idea. I can't remember the exact words, but he understands that this new life, which is so powerful and so strong, is blocked by that human propensity to puff up oneself rather than to honestly see oneself as one is. And that's very painful, very painful. I think Jung talks about the shadow, and I think that is a similar idea. There's just a tremendous urgency in human beings to avoid seeing that. But that's the paradox, is that in seeing the truth of our own weakness in ourselves, that an actual different being can step into our innermost soul and raise us up into life that is omnipotent in Christ, eternal. So that's the stumbling block for humanity. And I think the truth and valuing the truth is the way past that. Being willing to see oneself. And the Christian, actually, the true Christian is the one who has undergone that painful inward crucifixion, and has been surprised by the fact that that's not the end. There's a better life than was possible. Better life waiting for everybody. And that's the good news. But you can see why it's resisted. You can see why.
When I saw the word obedience in the context of marriage, I'm scanning years of different understandings, both inspired and led by Christ, and also from an outer Christian culture. And so the issue of submission, women to men, women to husbands, subjects to leadership, people to Christ. It's a huge one. We could spend months on it. And I think we need to touch on it. What Madeline shared is common because in the midst of true obedience to Christ, there is a fake and a false culture of submission and domination, issues of power within the church and within a marriage that aren't godly. And we need to acknowledge that that goes on as well. And our way forward in those relationships is submitting to Christ. And sometimes that includes not obeying the commands of man or who one's authority might appear to be. Many examples in the scriptures of an unjust leader and someone underneath submitting to the point where God would lead them to do differently. And we can't necessarily go back. And I'm trying to think of the many, many explanations for why a wife should always obey a husband and never not obey a husband that I've heard. And trying to fit oneself into obedience to the words in the Bible, being obedience to Christ. For example, there are passages about wives submit to your husbands, and him being her head as Christ is the head of the church, and other passages of submit yourself one to another. And yet we can't be led through that unless we go to Christ and we're led by Christ in it. And in discernment, where submission or obeying seems to be required, two people sincerely and honestly obeying God will find their way through that. But one can also discern when someone is invoking law in order to control. And we're not required to obey that, even in marriage. And the other thing is, let's say we do submit ourselves to an abusive or wrong or controlling individual in our church context, in our body of Christ context, or in our marital context. There is the passage about all things work together for good for them who love the Lord and are the called according, I believe, to his purpose. So sometimes we submit wrongly, but God brings us through it to learn something and to grow. And our character does get shaped. And our ego does decrease and he gets to increase. So I think there's redemption either way if we err, if our heart is still drawn back to being led and obedient to being led by Christ. It's a tough subject, and I also think it requires compassion for those who think differently than we do, because we haven't necessarily walked in their shoes and understood their circumstance. And so Christ is leading me to some austerity and obedience. And that's what he says to do. And that's what I'm led to do. Someone else may be being led a little differently. And I would want to seek understanding in that. Forgive me for speaking long.
I feel compelled to say I lived in an infantile paradise for a little over 2 years, the first 2 years of my life, with a loving mother. And then Daddy, who was, to put it plainly, a drunken bully, came back home from World War II, poisoned by all the traumatic effects of war. And he was terrifying. But the first thing I learned was he must be obeyed. And that was the kind of obedience that I'm allergic to. And I'm traumatized by its shadow. But I'm grateful I lived through it, so that I also see the kind of obedience going on in the world that results from the breaking, not the bending, but the breaking of the human will. I recently read an article about the revival of the spirit of Nazism in this country, in this culture, which I found plausible and persuasive. I don't fully understand how people's wills get broken, but I'm sure it happens. And in a world where I want to do the work of an evangelist wherever I can, I have to respect the fact that there are a lot of people out there whose wills are broken and who don't know it or aren't ready to acknowledge it. And that all I can hope to do is pray for them. And any soul I touch that's capable of understanding the freedom that one finds in submission and obedience to Christ, who really wants us to have a happy life. I mean, it's so full of joy. I can't describe the loveliness of a joyous life in obedience to Christ to somebody who can't imagine it, who only thinks of obedience as meaning, Big Brother or Hitler. It's something I can only pray about, but how delightful to meet someone who has come out of the dictatorship of another flawed person and into the wonderful freedom of slavery to Christ, if I can put it that way. I was taught to say, I want to be a slave to Jesus Christ by a black man. And when I heard him say that, I thought, how ashamed I am that I have to have, I mean, with all my cultural baggage of growing up in a racist society, I have to have a black friend go first in saying that. It was very humbling.
I am shocked to see that we are at the end of our time. Is there any last wisdom to be shared?
Well, I think that the breaking of the will happens when there is fear, a fear of consequences if one doesn't submit to another's will or to social convention or whatever is looks like a good alternative to one's own will. And I think that a good verse to end on is the one from 1 John, where it says, perfect love casteth out fear. And it's that perfect love that we know inwardly when Christ is available, when he appears, that convinces us that whatever the world can do is not worthy of our capitulation to it. And it reminded me of a passage in Fox's journal where he is threatened by someone who comes to one of the houses he's in and holds a rapier or a sword at his side, threatening to kill him. And Fox says, and you know he's speaking honestly. He says something like, it matters to me not one whit. And that is certainly a statement that comes from someone who has known the joy and affirmation that comes from knowing the Spirit of Christ.
Thank you, friends. I anticipate we will gather again. I believe it would be on the 7th of July. Quite look.
I think that's a Tuesday, the
Okay,
7th.
so I'll make it the 8th. And I imagine we'll be making a decision about our next reading.
Will we need to make that decision before that next meeting? Because we are at the end of this, or do we want to have a discussion at our next meeting about it?
Yeah, since there are so few of us here tonight, I think we will need to have a discussion. Although perhaps we can do it through email. Do you have thoughts, John?
I think we should discuss